In 1886, Frederick Ward Putnam came back to Adams County, Ohio, and stood on a narrow wooded plateau above Brush Creek, staring at something that archaeology still cannot fully explain. The Harvard researcher had already seen what decades of farming were doing to the ancient earthworks of the Ohio Valley. Plows were flattening them, trees and erosion were changing them. Whatever knowledge their builders had placed into the landscape was disappearing one furrow at a time. But this one was different. Across the ridge lay the body of an enormous serpent, bending through the grass, its tail wound into tight coils, and its head reaching toward a strange oval enclosure. When Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis had formally documented the place in 1848, they had recognized the same impossible shape beneath a forested landscape. Now Putnam wanted to save it before it vanished. He helped secure the property, excavated portions of the site between 1887 and 1889, and searched inside the serpent for the evidence that should have answered the obvious questions. Who built it? When? Why here? What did the enormous creature mean? The excavation gave him almost none of those answers. No diagnostic artifacts were recovered from the serpent itself. No inscription identified its builders. No burial explained its purpose. More than a century later, new radiocarbon dates would make the problem worse instead of better, and magnetic instruments would reveal a feature beneath the ground that nobody standing above it could see. The more carefully Serpent Mound has been studied, the less simple its story has become. Today, the Great Serpent Mound stretches roughly 1,300 feet across a bluff overlooking Brush Creek near Peebles, Ohio. It is one of the largest surviving prehistoric animal-shaped earthworks anywhere in the world. The serpent rises only a few feet above the surrounding ground, but from above its scale becomes obvious. A triple coil closes the tail. The body swings through a series of enormous curves. At the opposite end, an open-jawed form reaches toward an oval earthwork roughly 120 feet long. Nearby stand burial mounds from different periods of Native American history. Beneath the entire landscape lies another extraordinary feature, a deeply eroded meteorite impact structure several miles across, created hundreds of millions of years before human beings arrived in Ohio. One ancient monument rests on the scar of an event from deep geological time, and even that strange coincidence is only the beginning. Quick second before we go deeper, if this kind of investigation is why you're here, subscribe. It costs one click, and it helps me keep doing the slow research these places deserve. Because with Serpent Mound, the sensational stories are actually less interesting than the documented evidence. Back to it. The first mystery. Its age refuses to settle. In 1991, Robert Fletcher, Terry Cameron, Bradley Lepper, Deanne Weimer, William Pickard and their team returned to a place archaeologists had already disturbed more than a century earlier. They reopened what they believed was one of Putnam's old trenches and searched carefully for material that 19th century excavators could not have dated. What they found was tiny. Pieces of charcoal buried within the mound. Those fragments were enough to reset the archaeological clock. 2 radiocarbon results pointed toward roughly AD 995 to 1265, with dates clustering around the period archaeologists associate with Fort Ancient societies. Suddenly, a monument long attributed to the much earlier Adena tradition appeared to be medieval by North American standards. Built at roughly the same time Norman armies were crossing England, and major cities were flourishing far to the south in Mesoamerica. Serpent Mound seemed to have moved forward in time by more than 1,000 years. Then another team went back. Edward Herman, G. William Monahan, William Romaine, Timothy Schilling, Jared Burks and colleagues collected and analysed new samples, and in 2014 they published a radically different construction history. Their results supported the possibility that the Serpent had first been constructed during the early woodland period, around 300 BC, and then modified or renovated much later. But that conclusion did not end the argument. Bradley Lepper and other researchers challenged whether old carbon incorporated into mound fill can securely date the act of construction at all. Charcoal from an earlier occupation could have been dug up with soil and redeposited centuries later. That leaves two serious archaeological models on the table: an Adena Age serpent, later renewed by Fort Ancient people, or a primarily Fort Ancient monument containing older material. Ohio History Connection still acknowledges that more work is needed to clarify the age. The scientists have the carbon, they have the stratigraphy, they have decades of debate, and they still cannot give you a single undisputed year when that serpent first appeared on the ridge. The second mystery. The builders left no signature. When Frederick Ward Putnam cut into Serpent Mound during the late 1880s, this was the evidence archaeologists desperately wanted. Pottery could have connected the earthwork to a known ceramic tradition. A projectile point in a sealed construction layer could have narrowed the date. A burial might have linked the serpent to the mortuary customs of a specific culture. Imagine the trench opening through the body of one of the most famous earthworks in North America, layer after layer coming away, everyone waiting for the object that would identify the people responsible. Nothing diagnostic appeared inside the serpent. No cache of ceremonial objects, no recognizable grave assemblage, no artifact package saying Adena or Fort Ancient. The neighbouring landscape was full of cultural evidence. The serpent itself remained strangely mute. That silence matters because both major candidates make sense and both create problems. Nearby conical burial mounds produced evidence associated with the Adena tradition, which flourished long before the Fort Ancient period.
But the roughly AD 1120. Radiocarbon results recovered in the 20th century fit the Fort Ancient era, and serpent imagery is prominent in the iconography of later indigenous societies across eastern North America. Recent archaeology around the plateau has found traces of more than one period of occupation, meaning the place was not used once and abandoned. People returned here across centuries. So which community actually shaped the giant animal? Or did one people create it and another deliberately rebuild it? Archaeology usually solves identity through combinations of artifacts, architecture, and securely dated contexts. Here, the most important structure at the site withholds the most useful evidence. No name, no inscription, not a single diagnostic artifact sealed inside the serpent that everyone agrees identifies its builders. The third mystery. Something vanished from its neck. In 2011 and 2012, archaeologist Jared Burks surveyed Serpent Mound with a magnetic gradiometer, an instrument capable of detecting subtle differences in the magnetic properties of soil beneath the surface. There was no dramatic excavation, no hidden chamber opened. Burks simply moved instruments across ground that generations of visitors had already walked past. Then the data formed a shape. Near the serpent's neck appeared a curved magnetic anomaly, resembling another convolution of the body. You can stand above that location today and see essentially nothing unusual with your eyes.
Even LiDAR imagery does not make the feature obvious. But magnetically, a buried curve appears where the visible serpent no longer has one. That is one of the most unsettling pieces of legitimate evidence at Serpent Mound, because it raises a question about the monument's shape itself. Was the hidden curve part of an earlier version of the serpent? Was it intentionally removed during an ancient rebuilding episode? Could it represent a construction feature unrelated to the effigy? Researchers have also detected linear anomalies in the area, some of which may relate to drainage or much later activity, so geophysics does not automatically translate into prehistoric architecture. Archaeologists have been careful about that. The buried neck feature has not produced a universally accepted explanation, but place it beside the disputed carbon dates and a possibility emerges that is difficult to ignore. Serpent Mound may not have been constructed once. Its body may have been revised. What we see today could be only the final visible draft of a monument whose earlier geometry still survives underneath the soil. The fourth mystery. The serpent watches the solstice. Clark and Marjorie Hardman approached the mound from a different direction in the 1980s. Instead of digging into the earth, they looked outward toward the horizon. Their work drew attention to the orientation of the serpent's head and the setting sun near the summer solstice. Stand near the head around the longest days of the year, and the western horizon suddenly becomes part of the monument. The sun descends in the direction the serpent appears to face. This is not an internet-era invention. The alignment has been discussed for decades and is now acknowledged in interpretation of the site, including National Park Service material describing the summer solstice sunset alignment. The problem begins when we ask how much astronomy was intentionally encoded into the rest of the animal. Researchers and enthusiasts have proposed that bends in the serpent correspond with solstitial, equinoctial, or lunar rising positions. But short sightlines, curved features, and multiple possible observation points make those additional claims much harder to demonstrate. Even the clearest head-to-sunset relationship leaves an unresolved archaeological question. Did the builders choose this ridge specifically because its orientation allowed the serpent to meet the midsummer sun? Or did the shape follow the plateau and produce the alignment by chance? There is no surviving written explanation from the builders. No excavated marker tells us where an observer was meant to stand. We have geometry, we have a horizon, we have the sun returning to nearly the same place year after year. What we do not have is the instruction manual. If the alignment was intentional, then part of Serpent Mound's meaning may exist not in the earth at all, but in an event of light that lasts only minutes. The fifth mystery. Nobody knows what it holds. When Squire and Davis reached the site in the 1840s, the monument was forested. They had expected to examine something closer to defensive earthworks. Instead, as they mapped the ground, the shape resolved into an enormous serpent. At its head sat an oval enclosure. Their famous interpretation pictured a snake in the act of swallowing an egg, or perhaps a globe. It became the image generations of Americans inherited: serpent, open mouth, oval object. But that interpretation was never a translation of the builder's intentions. It was a 19th century guess. Later researchers proposed other possibilities. Some wondered whether the oval represented part of the head or an eye. Even the anatomical reading of the feature has shifted over time. Walk around that end of the mound, and the ambiguity becomes obvious. The earth gives you a shape, but no caption. An egg would imply one kind of story. A celestial disk might imply another. An eye changes the animal's anatomy entirely. Earlier writers often compared Serpent Mound to Old World religious imagery, interpretations modern archaeology has rejected because the monument belongs in the cultural history of indigenous North America, not imaginary migrations from Egypt or Assyria. But correcting those old mistakes does not magically reveal the original symbolism. The builders belonged to societies with sophisticated ceremonial traditions, and serpent imagery carried powerful meanings across parts of eastern North America. Which meaning is embodied here remains unsettled. The oval is still there. You can walk beside it, you can measure it, you can photograph it from above. What you cannot do is ask its makers what they intended you to see. The sixth mystery. The ground was struck from space. Geologists began noticing that the rocks around Serpent Mound were wrong long before they could explain why. Beneath Adams, Highland, and Pike counties lies a circular zone of broken, faulted, and uplifted bedrock. For years it was called the Serpent Mound crypto-explosion structure, a deliberately cautious name because geologists knew some enormous explosive event had disturbed the strata, but did not yet know what kind. Then came the rocks that settle impact debates, shatter cones, and microscopic shock features. In 1960, geologist Robert S. Dietz reported shatter cones associated with the structure. Later, microscopic evidence of shock metamorphism strengthened the case. The Ohio Department of Natural Resources now identifies Serpent Mound as one of the confirmed impact structures in the United States. Estimates of its original dimensions have changed as geologists mapped it. Work by Keith Milam proposed a maximum rim diameter of roughly 14 kilometers, substantially larger than earlier estimates, near 8 kilometers. The impact occurred hundreds of millions of years before the mound was built, so there is no scientific basis for claims that its builders witnessed the meteorite. They did not. The crater's original dramatic surface form had been heavily erased by erosion on a timescale vastly longer than human history. But the altered geology still helped shape the terrain they encountered. Sinkholes and unusual topographic features occur around the impact zone, and the Serpent occupies the western part of this extraordinary geological landscape. Here is where the mystery remains legitimate. Did the ancient builders recognize something unusual about this place without knowing its extraterrestrial origin? Did springs, rock exposures, sinkholes, elevations, or other visible features make the plateau culturally significant? Archaeology has no document saying they knew the landscape was unusual, so that connection cannot be claimed as fact. Yet the coincidence remains almost cinematic, a monumental serpent whose meaning is lost, built on terrain deformed by a cosmic collision older than the dinosaurs. Tell me in the comments, if you lived here centuries before geology existed as a science, what would this landscape have told you? The seventh mystery. The plateau remembers different peoples. In 2011, a practical construction project gave archaeologists another rare look beneath the surface. Before restroom renovation and sewage work could disturb the protected site, Kevin Schwartz, David Lamp, and the ASC group investigated the affected areas. Their trenches were not carved through the serpent itself, they were placed elsewhere on the plateau, including near a large conical mound previously excavated by Putnam. As the soil came away, the team recovered prehistoric material, showing that this was not a landscape frozen in one moment. Hundreds of artifacts had already been documented around an ash-rich deposit in Putnam's work, and modern investigations found additional evidence belonging to multiple periods. Pottery, stone debris, burned material, and other remains revealed people repeatedly occupying or using this ridge. One charcoal sequence associated with Fort Ancient activity produced dates between approximately AD 1041 and 1211. Nearby burial mounds also point to more than one cultural period. Two are associated with Adena traditions, and another with the Fort Ancient period. Put those dates beside the two competing histories of the serpent, and something strange happens. The controversy stops looking like a simple choice between Adena and Fort Ancient. The plateau itself contains evidence of both. That makes a multi-stage history entirely plausible, but it also makes dating loose charcoal extraordinarily dangerous. Older material can be redeposited, later people can revisit older sacred places. A monument can be repaired without being newly invented. Archaeologists can demonstrate continuity of use more confidently than they can reconstruct the intentions behind every episode. So the question changes. Maybe we should not ask only who built Serpent Mound. Maybe we should ask how many generations believed this exact ridge was important enough to return to. The eighth mystery. The dead are beside it, not inside it. Putnam's excavations made that contrast impossible to miss. Near the giant effigy stood conical mounds and burial areas. When archaeologists opened those features, human remains and cultural materials appeared. One nearby conical mound measured about 70 feet across and approximately 9 feet high in Putnam's era, despite years of agricultural damage. Elsewhere on the property, graves and evidence of occupation confirmed that death, ceremony, and daily activity had all touched this plateau. If Serpent Mound was simply another burial monument, archaeologists had every reason to expect the excavation to reveal something comparable inside its body. It did not. The serpent is monumental, labor-intensive, and unmistakably deliberate, yet it is not known as a tomb filled with the kind of burial assemblage recovered from neighboring mounds. That absence may tell us more than another artifact would. Someone organized the construction of more than a quarter-mile of raised earth. Soil had to be moved, shaped, and maintained according to a plan visible most clearly from above or from elevated viewpoints. And yet the builders apparently did not need to place a rich burial at the center to make the monument important. That pushes interpretation towards ceremony, cosmology, territorial memory, or some combination we cannot reconstruct. But archaeologists cannot simply assign a ritual and close the file. Ceremonial is not an explanation when the ceremony itself is unknown. Why build an enormous serpent beside burial mounds rather than make the serpent a burial mound? Why place human remains in nearby conical monuments while leaving the effigy without the same clear function? The physical relationship survives, the behavioral logic does not. That missing explanation has lasted longer than almost everything the builders made from wood, fiber, or skin. The ninth mystery. We may not see the original serpent. Go back to Frederick Ward Putnam in the late 19th century. When he arrived, cultivation, erosion, and vegetation had already affected the site. He was not simply studying Serpent Mound, he was trying to preserve it, and preservation in that era often meant reconstruction. Putnam's team cleared vegetation, excavated parts of the monument, and then restored the earthwork into the form they believed represented its ancient configuration. Photographs and maps preserve glimpses of what they encountered, but the site visitors see now has passed through that 19th century intervention, more than a century of maintenance, and the natural movement of soil. Putnam saved Serpent Mound from possible destruction. He also became part of its physical history. Then magnetic survey complicated the picture again. That invisible neck convolution detected by Jared Burks does not neatly match the surface form preserved today. Earlier maps also differ in details, especially around the head and oval. Some differences reflect measurement methods, vegetation, and illustration. Others may reflect real alteration. Scientists cannot peel away every restoration, erosion event, animal burrow, and ancient rebuilding phase like transparent sheets and recover a perfect original blueprint. That means the serpent in front of us may be simultaneously authentic and incomplete. An ancient earthwork, modified by ancient people, damaged by later land use, interpreted and restored by 19th century archaeologists, and maintained in the present. Imagine discovering that the most famous feature in the landscape may contain another version of itself beneath the grass. Which curve belongs to the first builders? Which belongs to later native renovators? Which shape was strengthened by Putnam? We can map the body down to inches. We still cannot guarantee that the body we map is exactly the one its first makers intended. And that is what makes Serpent Mound more disturbing than the legends surrounding it. We do not need hidden civilizations, supernatural energy, or impossible technology. The documented archaeology is stranger. A 1,300-foot serpent lies on an Ohio ridge, and professional researchers still debate whether its first construction belongs around 300 BC or more than 1,000 years later. The earthwork contains no diagnostic artifact that settles the identity of its builders. Magnetometry has detected what may be an erased or buried curve in its neck. Its head faces toward the summer solstice sunset, but the full astronomical purpose remains uncertain. Its oval feature has been called an egg, a globe, an eye, and part of the serpent itself, without any surviving explanation from the people who shaped it. The plateau contains burials and occupation from different eras. Beneath everything lies the shattered geology of an ancient meteorite impact. And the visible monument has itself passed through excavation, restoration, and centuries of change. You can still go there. That matters. This is not an artifact locked in a private collection or a vanished site known only from an old notebook. The serpent is still stretched across the bluff right now. The tail still coils in the grass. The head still reaches toward the western horizon. Around the summer solstice, the sun still lowers in front of it, just as it did before Europeans arrived in Ohio. Beneath the surface, the magnetic trace near its neck is still there. Beneath that lies a plateau used by human beings across different periods. Beneath that, rocks still carry the scars of an impact that happened hundreds of millions of years before any human story began. Maybe that is the real lesson of Serpent Mound. History rarely survives as a clean message. It survives in layers. One generation builds, another returns, another repairs. Centuries later, strangers excavate what remains and try to reconstruct a language made from soil, horizon, and memory. Science can tell us the age of charcoal, measure magnetic anomalies, and identify shock metamorphism in ancient rock. But measurement is not the same thing as meaning. At Serpent Mound, we can document almost every physical dimension of the mystery, while still being unable to hear the sentence its builders were trying to say. So when you look down at that enormous serpent, what are you actually seeing? A monument created once, a sacred place rebuilt across generations, an astronomical marker, a myth written into the earth, or several of those things, layered together until their boundaries disappeared. If someone you know loves mysteries that are more powerful because they are real, share this video with them and ask them the same question. After more than a century of archaeology, why does Serpent Mound still refuse to give us one final answer?